My mom stole my college fund after Grandma died, so I exposed her at her wedding and got her arrested. I lost my grandma when I was 18. She was a strong, no-nonsense woman who ran her own upholstery business for over 50 years and raised 3 kids, my mom being the middle one. Growing up, I often saw my grandma and mom argue over small things. And I used to wonder why until I eventually realized my grandma resented my mom because of me. For context, my aunt once told me that my parents never truly wanted me. They held resentment toward me from the moment I was born. For the first 6 months of my life, I lived with my grandma. But once I started getting older, she made my parents step up and take responsibility for raising me as a kid. I was called all sorts of hurtful names by my parents, especially my dad. If I made the slightest mistake, he'd call me things like bimbo or dumbo. Those words cut deep. Ironically, despite those insults, I ended up being the most academically successful among my cousins. Thanks to early encouragement from my parents, I developed a deep passion for science and set my sights on earning a degree in the field. Still, my parents were harsh. They used to hit me for reasons that seemed completely unreasonable, like wearing nail polish or talking to a boy. My dad never let me wear makeup, and he hated when I wore anything even slightly fitted. Like yoga pants even, if I paired them with a long shirt. Basically, anything remotely feminine was off limits. I was still just a growing teen, and his constant need for control left a lasting impact on me. Whenever my parents fought, it somehow always became my fault. On top of that, my mom constantly complained that I didn't help out around the house. In truth, I was taught from an early age to do my part. I folded at least 2 loads of laundry daily, cleaned a bathroom each day, washed the dishes, and handled other chores like sweeping. Despite all that, I never complained, but my efforts were never acknowledged. I felt like an unappreciated maid. In my own home, back then, I did almost everything my parents told me to. I avoided what they disapproved of. I never drank, never touched drugs, and stayed away from wearing anything they considered inappropriate. Still, I wasn't allowed to hang out with friends, not even for birthdays. I couldn't invite anyone over either. Sometimes, I'd come up with excuses to stay later at school, just so I could spend time around people in a space that didn't feel suffocating. Then, everything shifted when my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer. As much as I resented him for controlling every part of my life, I still didn't want to lose him. My mom, on the other hand, didn't feel the same. She left him, saying she didn't want to be stuck caring for a sick husband. My dad and I were stunned as we watched her pack up and walk out. Later that day, he broke down on the porch. I was only 14, but I could still understand his pain. I had seen him sit out there with a beer on bad days before, so I quietly grabbed one from the fridge and handed it to him. When he saw me standing there with that beer, trying to comfort him the only way I knew how, he just started sobbing. Something changed between us from that moment on. I don't know what exactly or why it happened, but my dad stopped being cruel to me. In fact, he became a good father. After my mom left, they divorced pretty quickly thanks to a prenup. She couldn't take any alimony. Within a month, my mom had already moved in with her new boyfriend, her high school sweetheart, Morty. Around this time, she clearly hated having me visit on the weekends. Whenever my dad drove me over to drop me off, she always had some excuse ready for why she couldn't take me. It hurt deeply. It felt like my mom had divorced me too, not just my dad. Through all of this, my grandma stayed present in my life. I loved spending time with her. She'd call me and all my cousins once a month to come over for a sleepover. Those nights are still some of my favorite memories. 5 months after my parents' divorce, my mom married her high school sweetheart, Morty. He even bought her a house, hoping they could build a life and start a family together. But my mom clearly had other priorities. Whenever I visited, I'd find her on the phone, laughing and chatting with someone else, completely carefree until the moment Morty walked through the door, when she'd quickly hang up. Eventually, Morty discovered she was cheating. They had a massive argument, but my mom somehow convinced him it was just a one-time slip. So, they stayed together. During all this, my dad's health kept declining. In his final days, he tried to spend as much time with me as possible. Come home from school filled with dread, terrified I might find something had happened. And one night, that fear became real. After months of failed chemo, he passed away in his sleep. My grandma and dad's side of the family were the first to reach out to me. I couldn't stop crying. When my mom arrived, she came alone, no Morty. I didn't know it at the time, but she'd kept talking to the other guy behind Morty's back, and he had finally walked away for good. At my dad's funeral, my mom kept saying his death came at the worst possible time for her because she already had so much going on. Everyone was shocked and disgusted by her insensitivity. When my dad's will was read, it was revealed that all of his assets were left to me. Suddenly, my mother was very interested in being part of my life again, but my grandma wasn't having it. She knew the kind of woman her daughter was and understood my mom only wanted me for the inheritance. She and my aunt helped me sell my dad's assets and set up a college trust fund in my name. However, since I was still a minor, my mother's name had to be added to the fund. Meanwhile, Morty divorced my mom. And since they didn't have a prenup, she walked away with a significant settlement. That's why Grandma warned her not to touch my college fund. She already had her own money. My mom agreed. When we started living together, it felt like I was sharing a home with a complete stranger. She had changed so much over the years, not in a good way. She acted more like a teenager than a mother. She'd dress up and go out every night, often bringing home random men and taking them straight to her bedroom. Every morning, I'd walk into the kitchen and find a different man sitting there. It became a depressing routine. When I turned 16, my mom introduced me to her third husband, Joe. From the very beginning, he clearly didn't like me. He was cold, mean, and constantly critical. Whenever I brought it up to my mom, she would confront him, but that only made things worse. He just became more passive-aggressive and bitter behind her back. 10 months later, my baby brother Brad was born. That's when everything changed. Again, my mom began portraying Joe as a misunderstood man who just didn't know how to express his feelings. She urged me not to hate him and told me I needed to be more understanding. But Joe had no trouble expressing affection, just not to me. He adored Brad and never missed a chance to show it, strangely. My mom would often confide in me that she and Joe had nothing in common. She admitted she only married him because he could offer a stable family. But that couldn't be further from the truth. After Brad was born, they started fighting all the time. Joe didn't want my mom spending any time with me and would yell at her if she wasn't glued to Brad 24/7. Joe would say cruel things to me, like how he wished I had died with my dad, or that I should have gone to live with my grandma. He said he wanted his son to get all the love and attention. It was emotionally draining to live in a house where I was clearly unwanted. Whenever I questioned my mom or begged her to leave Joe, she would always find a way to change the subject. Eventually, my mom and Joe began dropping Brad and me off at Grandma's so they could go out with their friends. What started as an occasional weekend thing quickly became a regular pattern almost every weekend. They usually asked me to babysit Brad while they were out. But that particular night, I had an important exam to study for, so they left both of us with Grandma. I loved being at Grandma's. She always cooked something delicious and made sure I was comfortable while I studied. Brad played quietly with his toys on the living room floor as I worked at the table. Grandma had clearly told my parents to pick us up by 11 p.m. But when the clock crept past 11 and they still hadn't returned, I grew increasingly uneasy. With exams the next day and Brad needing to get to bed on time, more risk Joe yelling. At my couldn't help but worry. Meanwhile, my grandma kept calling and even left 3 angry voicemails for them. Finally, at midnight, they showed up completely wasted. Both of them stumbled in, giggling like teenagers, clearly drunk out of their minds. We were stunned they'd even managed to drive without getting caught. Joe went to pick up Brad, while my mom told me to grab my things so we could head home. But my grandma wasn't having it. She immediately raised her voice, scolding them for arriving so late and being drunk, especially since they were supposed to be responsible for 2 kids. She told Joe there was no way he was taking his son home in that condition. She offered to call them an Uber and insisted they leave the car behind. But Joe snapped. He argued with my grandma, telling her to mind her own business, shouting that he was the father and knew what was best for his child. The argument escalated fast, filled with yelling and foul language. My mom just stood there silently, clearly too drunk to process anything or say a word. I could feel the tension rise like a boiling pot about to overflow. I begged them to stop, reminding them they were scaring Brad. But no one listened. The shouting continued. Joe turned his rage toward me and Grandma, shouting that he had never liked us but tolerated us for my mom's sake. That comment pushed my grandma over the edge, and in a burst of fury, she threatened to call the police. That's when it happened. Joe, drunk and enraged, did something unforgivable. He slapped my grandma across the face. The sound of it cracked through the room like a whip. I screamed, frozen in horror. "Stop it! Just stop!" I yelled, but Joe didn't even look at me. Brad started crying hysterically, clearly terrified. My grandma, holding her cheek, screamed for me to call the police. Tears streamed down my face as I dialed 911. I don't even remember what I said. I was crying too much, but thankfully, the operator stayed on the line with me until officers arrived. When Joe heard the approaching sirens, his face changed from fury to fear. Suddenly, he was pleading with my grandma, begging her not to press charges, saying it would ruin both his and my mom's lives. But it was too late. Joe was arrested and charged with assault, taken away in handcuffs. As he was being dragged out, he kept begging my mom to help him. She had stood there frozen the entire time, but now she started crying and screaming at him. My grandma made it very clear if my mom didn't file for divorce, she would call Child Protective Services and have both of us taken away. My mom nodded in fear, finally grasping the severity of the situation. It was only later I learned that she and Joe hadn't just been drinking that night, they'd also used drugs. The only reason she wasn't arrested was because she hadn't been belligerent like Joe. That night, Brad and I stayed with my grandma. I refused to go back with my mom, was too angry, too shaken. I felt betrayed and disgusted by what I had witnessed. Thankfully, the next day, my mom seemed to come to her senses. She realized what Joe had done and filed for divorce immediately. She forbade him from ever coming near us again. When the rest of the family found out what happened, they were furious. They cornered my mom with endless questions. Why had she waited so long to act? Why hadn't she seen the signs? My aunt and uncle screamed at her until she broke down in tears. They were so angry they said they never wanted to speak to her again for what her husband had done and for allowing it to get that far. Because Joe was a first-time offender, the court sentenced him to probation. He had to attend counseling and was legally prohibited from approaching us. He was only allowed to see Brad if my mom permitted and if she was present. Joe did try to win my mother back, sending messages and begging for forgiveness, but she never responded. She finalized the divorce and walked away with a generous settlement. Since then, she's been living comfortably. But after everything, I couldn't bring myself to live with her again. So I packed all my belongings and moved in with my grandma. Brad, however, stayed behind with my mom. Mom didn't like this arrangement one bit. She had been depending on me to babysit Brad, but she couldn't say a word about it. She knew Grandma would tear into her if she dared. This year, I celebrated my 18th birthday. I was so excited to finally be an adult and start a new chapter of my life. But life had other plans. Just 1 week after my birthday, my grandma passed away from a sudden heart attack. It was completely unexpected. She hadn't had any history of heart problems. After the funeral, the entire family gathered to hear her will. She had carefully divided her assets. My mom and aunt each received a fair share of her jewelry and family heirlooms, which were quite valuable. To her eldest son, my uncle, she left her car, which he had always admired. For my cousins, she set up funds to help cover their future college expenses. And for me, she left her house. She'd told my aunt that, since I was the closest to her and had been living with her, she didn't want me to ever have to go back to live with my mom again. I was shocked and overwhelmed. I started crying, not out of sadness, but gratitude. That house wasn't just a roof over my head. It held so many of my happiest memories. Unfortunately, Grandma didn't leave anything for Brad. I don't know if she forgot, or if it was because he was just my half-brother. Either way, my mom was livid. She immediately complained that giving me a house was worth way more than any jewelry and that it was completely unfair of her mother to leave me so much. No one else had a problem with Grandma's decisions. Everyone understood that she had given each of us exactly what we deserved. But my mom kept pushing the issue, even yelling about how selfish Grandma was for leaving Brad out of the will. That was the last straw for me. I snapped and told her she should be grateful Grandma left her anything at all, especially after the way her ex-husband had treated her. She was furious and yelled that I had no right to bring up the past. I just scoffed and rolled my eyes. Then she started trying to manipulate me, telling me I should sell the house and move in with her. I told her point blank that I loved Grandma's place and would never sell it. It wasn't about money. It was about what it meant to me. She kept trying to convince me, but I held firm. I have to say it's been amazing living on my own. 4. The first time I wasn't surrounded by toxic people. I'd never lived by myself before, but I've really grown to enjoy it. I've been spending a lot of time with myself and going to therapy to process Grandma's death with everything going on. I decided to take a gap year. But since I was no longer a minor, I wanted to remove my mother from my trust fund. I needed her signature to access it and to remove her as a beneficiary. So, 2 months ago, I went to talk to her. That's when she introduced me to her new boyfriend, Robin. She had apparently been dating him for a few weeks. He seemed like a nice enough guy, although much younger than her. Unlike her past relationships, he didn't seem rough or shady. Still, I didn't bring up the age gap, had more important things to discuss. I asked to speak with her privately, and she agreed. I assumed it would be a simple conversation about my trust. After all, it was money that my dad had left for me. But the moment I mentioned removing her from the trust, she panicked. I found that strange. I reminded her that this was always the plan, and now that I was 18, I wanted full control over my finances. But she refused. She said I was still too young, and, since I wasn't going to college this year, there was no need to make changes. Her reaction made me uneasy. I tried to press, but she kept insisting that I could come to her any time for the money when I eventually started college. I didn't say much after that, spent some time with Brad, then headed home. It wasn't until I was driving back that a thought hit me: what if she had already been dipping into my trust fund? At first, it seemed too far-fetched, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. So I decided to consult a lawyer. I asked them to help me understand the terms of the trust and what I could do. After reviewing everything, the lawyer confirmed that I would need my mom's signature to fully access the funds or to remove her as a beneficiary. But they also said I was allowed to request a balance statement. That's when I went to the bank and discovered what my mother had done. When I confronted her, she insisted that because she was my mother and had raised me, she had every right to use the money as she pleased. I was stunned by her arrogance and lack of remorse. It was truly disgusting. Looking around, I could see the shock and judgment on everyone's face, says her guests. Robin's family, even the priest, couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Robin stepped away from her, clearly shaken. "You lied to me," he said, his voice cold. "You never mentioned being married 3 times and stealing your daughter's college money. What kind of person does that?" My mother tried to grab his hand to explain, but he pulled away. My aunt stepped forward and confirmed everything I had said. She backed me up in front of everyone, stating that she had personally helped set up the trust fund after my dad's death. My uncle chimed in too, adding that they had all seen the bank statements and had no doubt about what had happened. My cousins nodded, adding weight to the truth that now hung in the air like a thundercloud. The ceremony was over. There was no way anyone was going to continue celebrating after that. The priest awkwardly stepped aside, unsure what to do. Some guests started leaving, whispering among themselves, shooting disgusted glances at my mom. Robin's parents came up to him and whispered something before walking away, clearly not wanting to be involved in the drama. Robin himself stood still for a moment, processing everything. Then, without another word, he took off his boutonniere and dropped it on the floor before walking out of the church. Leaving my mother behind, my mom stood there, speechless, humiliated in front of everyone. For once, she couldn't talk her way out of it, as people began to file out. My mom tried to follow Robin, but he was already gone. I turned to her and, in front of everyone, said, "You thought you could steal from me, lie to everyone, and still come out clean? You messed with the wrong daughter." She glared at me, then looked around and realized no one was coming to her defense. Not one person. Even her closest friends had either left or were standing awkwardly to the side. I handed the documents to my lawyer that same evening and filed a legal complaint against her for misappropriation of funds and breach of trust, because the trust was specifically created for my education, and the funds had been withdrawn without my consent and for personal use. I had a strong case. The bank records were undeniable. As of now, the legal process is ongoing. My lawyer is confident we'll win. I may never get all of my dad's money back, but at least she won't get away with what she did. After the wedding disaster, my mom tried calling me. She sent messages saying I had ruined her life, how no one wanted to talk to her anymore, and how Robin left her because of me. But I didn't respond. Not anymore. I've blocked her on everything. I don't care to hear her excuses, her lies, or her guilt-tripping. She made her choices and now she can live with the consequences. As for me, I've started applying to colleges again. I've been working part-time, saving every bit I can. My grandma's house is still my safe space, filled with love, peace, and memories of someone who actually cared about me. And no matter what happens next, I know one thing for sure. I will never be like my mother. She tried to justify herself, insisting that since she'd practically raised me, the least I could do was let her have the money that as my mother, she deserved it. That's when Robin finally spoke up, asking if this was how they'd managed to afford such a lavish wedding by spending my trust fund. My mother said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. And that's when all hell broke loose. I couldn't hold back my anger any longer. I started yelling at her, and soon the entire room exploded with chaos. My relatives jumped in, outraged by my mom's selfish betrayal. She tried to defend herself, shouting that it was a private matter between us and no one else had the right to judge her, but things quickly spiraled. My aunt, furious, stepped a little too close to my mom, and the confrontation turned physical. Shoving broke out, voices raised even higher. And someone ended up calling the police. When the officers arrived, my mom refused to calm down. She kept screaming and flailing, completely out of control. So they arrested her on the spot. I went to the station with my aunt to give my statement. Since then, my mother has been officially charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. Even as I write this, it feels surreal. I never imagined I'd have my own mother arrested. I never thought she would steal from me her own child. But she did. And it broke something inside me that can never be fixed. In the days following her arrest, my phone hasn't stopped ringing. Some people have called out of concern, others not so kindly. A few distant relatives think I went too far, that I shouldn't have embarrassed her publicly or involved the police. But my side of the family stands by me. They believe I did the right thing. Still, this has all been so overwhelming. I've found myself asking, did I go too far? Thank you, everyone, for your kind words and support. When I first posted, I was overthinking everything. I felt deeply guilty. I've never hated my mom, not truly. At least not until she pulled this stunt. I never wanted to press charges. It still feels like a nightmare I can't wake up from. But I now realize this is all the result of her choices. For those of you worried about me, I'm okay. My uncle helped me find a great lawyer, and he's confident we'll win the lawsuit. My only goal is to recover what was stolen and move forward with my life. As for Brad, thank you to everyone who asked about him. He's doing okay. He's still too young to fully understand what's happening. For now, he's staying with Joe and his family while things settle. It's been 6 months since my last update. Many of you have been asking how things turned out. I wasn't allowed to say much earlier because of the court proceedings, but now I can finally share the outcome. The court ruled in my favor. My mother has been ordered to repay every single penny she stole from my college trust fund. She cried and pleaded in court, but the judge was firm. She now has to liquidate her assets, including possibly selling her house to pay me back. Writing this feels incredible. These past few months were brutal on my mental health. I often felt lost, overwhelmed, and isolated. But what kept me going was the memory of my grandma and dad. I know Grandma would be proud that I stood up for myself. And I know Dad would have wanted me to use that money to invest in my future, just like he intended. It's been 3 months since the ruling. How was everyone's new year? Mine was fantastic. My mother, now facing the full weight of her actions, has officially repaid the entire amount she embezzled from my trust fund. The court process forced her hand, and while I doubt she's truly sorry, at least the financial damage has been undone. I've also made the difficult but necessary decision to cut my mom out of my life completely. The rest of my family agrees. We all chose to distance ourselves from her. She's tried reaching out, acting as if she expects forgiveness or a reset button. But we're done pretending. Some lines just can't be UNCROSSED. Lately, I've been checking out college brochures and thinking seriously about what's next for me in 2024. Surprisingly, this gap year has been one of the best things I could have done. Despite the legal nightmare, it gave me time to reflect, heal, and find myself spending time with my cousins and the rest of the family has helped more than I can express. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm surrounded by love, and that gives me hope for the future.